They lied to you about Whitney Houston. For 25 years, the music industry has hidden the biggest secret in entertainment history. While you mourned the decline of her voice and watched her struggles play out in tabloids, there was something else, something extraordinary, locked away in a vault that could have saved her career and restored her legend. Tonight, you'll discover the truth they never wanted you to know about Whitney's greatest work, and it will change everything you believed about her final years. Hidden in the archives of Arista Records lies a complete album that Whitney Houston recorded in 1999, 12 songs that represent the most mature, sophisticated, and emotionally honest work of her entire career. This wasn't the struggling Whitney you saw in the headlines. This was an artist at her creative peak, working with the best songwriters and producers money could buy, creating music that would have reminded the world why she was called the Voice. So why have you never heard these songs? Why was an album that cost over $3 million to produce buried so deep that even die-hard Whitney fans don't know it exists? And why did Clive Davis, the man who built Whitney's career, personally order every master recording sealed away where no one could ever release them? Back in Whitney's day, record labels controlled everything. They decided what you heard, when you heard it, and how much you paid for it. There was no internet, no social media, no way for artists to connect directly with their fans. When a label decided to bury an album, it disappeared completely, and that's exactly what happened to Whitney's masterpiece. The story begins in early 1999, when Whitney was facing the biggest crisis of her career. Her previous album had underperformed, critics were questioning her vocal abilities, and personal problems were starting to overshadow her professional achievements. The woman who had dominated the 1980s and early 1990s suddenly seemed irrelevant in an age of teen pop stars and hip-hop dominance. But Whitney Houston wasn't finished. Behind closed doors, she was working on something special, an album that would prove her critics wrong and reclaim her position as music's greatest voice. She assembled a dream team of collaborators: Babyface, who had crafted hits for every major R&B star of the decade; David Foster, the producer behind some of the most sophisticated pop music ever recorded; and Diane Warren, whose emotional ballads had become the soundtrack to a generation's most important moments. The recording sessions took place at the legendary Hit Factory in New York City, the same studio where Whitney had created some of her greatest early hits. But this time was different. Instead of the young, eager-to-please artist who had recorded "I Wanna Dance with Somebody," here was a mature woman with real-life experience, real pain, and real wisdom to share through her music. The songs they created together were unlike anything Whitney had ever recorded. Unbroken, a soaring ballad about surviving life's hardest challenges, showcased a voice that had gained richness and depth through experience. Stronger Than Before combined contemporary R&B production with Whitney's gospel-trained power, creating something that could have dominated both urban and mainstream radio. Mother's Prayer, written about her hopes and fears for her daughter Bobby Christina, was perhaps the most emotionally raw performance of Whitney's career. But the album's centerpiece was Rise Again, a song that seemed to predict Whitney's entire future. Working with Diane Warren, she had created an anthem about redemption, about falling down and finding the strength to get back up, about proving wrong everyone who counted you out. When Whitney sang, "They thought my story was over, but I'm just getting started," it felt like a promise to the world that the real Whitney Houston was coming back. The recordings were pristine. Whitney's voice, far from being damaged by years of strain, had developed a maturity and emotional resonance that her earlier work had only hinted at. The production was contemporary enough to compete with anything on radio, but sophisticated enough to appeal to adult listeners who had grown up with Whitney's music. Industry insiders who heard early tracks were stunned. This wasn't a nostalgia act trying to recapture past glory. This was an artist in full command of her powers, creating music that could have defined a new phase of her career. Rolling Stone's senior music editor, after hearing Rise Again, in a private listening session, wrote in his notes, "If this is Whitney damaged, I can't imagine what Whitney healed sounds like." But then something happened that no one expected. As the album neared completion, Clive Davis began having second thoughts. The Whitney Houston he had created was a specific brand, untouchable, perfect, aspirational. This new album revealed a different Whitney, vulnerable, scarred, human. It acknowledged struggles that the Whitney Houston brand had never admitted existed. Market research groups didn't help. Focus groups of Whitney's core demographic, women who had grown up with her music in the 1980s, loved the emotional honesty, but weren't sure they wanted their perfect pop princess to be so real. Younger listeners appreciated the contemporary production, but weren't invested enough in Whitney's story to care about her comeback. Radio programmers worried that the themes were too heavy for their carefully crafted playlists. The nail in the coffin came from an unexpected source: Whitney herself. As she listened to the completed album, she began to have doubts. The songs were beautiful, but they were also deeply personal. They revealed truths about her life, her struggles, and her family that she wasn't sure she wanted the world to know. In an era before celebrities routinely shared their most private moments, this level of emotional transparency felt dangerous. The decision to shelve the album wasn't made all at once. First, the release date was pushed back for additional production work. Then it was delayed again for strategic marketing development. Finally, it was quietly removed from the release schedule altogether, with no official announcement or explanation. The master recordings were locked away in Arista's climate-controlled vault, along with thousands of other unreleased tracks from the label's history. The only people who knew they existed were the handful of executives, producers, and engineers who had worked on the project, and they were all bound by confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing what they had heard. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. The album could have changed everything. In 1999, Whitney Houston was still young enough and talented enough to mount a serious comeback. Her voice, while different from her younger years, was still powerful and distinctive. The music industry was beginning to embrace the idea that artists could have multiple acts in their careers, that maturity and experience could be valuable rather than liabilities. Artists like Tina Turner had proven that it was possible to reinvent yourself and find new success. Cher was about to have the biggest hit of her career with Believe. Madonna was constantly evolving her sound and image. Whitney's Lost album could have positioned her as a mature artist with something important to say, rather than a former star trying to recapture past glory. The financial impact was staggering. Arista Records had invested over $3 million in recording costs, plus additional money for planned marketing and promotion. That investment simply vanished, written off as a tax loss and buried in the corporate filing cabinets. The songs that could have generated millions in revenue and restored Whitney's commercial viability were locked away like toxic waste. But the human cost was even higher. Whitney never spoke publicly about the shelved album, but friends and family noticed a change in her after the project was abandoned. The optimism and creative energy that had carried her through the recording sessions gave way to disappointment and resignation. She had poured her heart into music that would never be heard, and the rejection of such personal work was devastating. The Lost album represents a turning point in Whitney's life and career. If it had been released, if it had been successful, her entire trajectory might have been different. Instead of the declining years that followed, she could have entered the 2000s as an artist reborn, with a new generation of fans and a renewed sense of purpose. Industry veterans who worked on the project still speak about it in hushed tones, describing it as one of the great what-ifs of modern music. They talk about songs that could have been classics, performances that rank among Whitney's best, and an artistic vision that was decades ahead of its time in terms of emotional honesty and musical sophistication. In today's music industry, where artists routinely share their struggles and vulnerabilities, Whitney's Lost album would have been celebrated as groundbreaking. The personal revelations that seemed dangerous in 1999 would be seen as authentic and relatable now. The mature themes that worried focus groups would resonate with audiences hungry for real emotion and honest storytelling. The tragedy isn't just that great music was buried. It's that an artist who desperately needed validation and creative fulfillment was denied both. Whitney Houston spent the last 13 years of her life knowing that some of her best work would never be heard, that the album that could have saved her career was locked away by the very people who claimed to want her success. Today, those master recordings still exist somewhere in the Sony music archives. Arista was eventually absorbed by Sony. They represent not just lost commercial opportunity, but lost cultural heritage. In an era when previously unreleased music from artists like Prince and David Bowie generates massive interest and critical acclaim, Whitney's lost album remains forgotten. But perhaps that's about to change. As we approach the 25th anniversary of its recording, insiders are beginning to speak more openly about what was lost. Estate lawyers are reviewing contracts to see what might be possible, and a new generation of Whitney Houston fans who never got to hear her at her creative peak are demanding access to every piece of her artistic legacy. The vault that has held Whitney's masterpiece for a quarter century might finally be ready to open. The album that could have changed her life may yet change how we remember her legacy, because sometimes the most important music is the music we never got to hear.